Welcome to Aptera's brief introduction to setting science-based targets for reducing emissions. The Science-Based Targets Initiative, better known as SBTi, is a non-profit that defines best practices for setting emissions reduction targets that are aligned to current climate science. Their framework shows companies how much they need to reduce emissions to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. The goal of this agreement is to keep global warming levels below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. To achieve the Paris Agreement goals and avoid catastrophic global warming, global greenhouse gas emissions must reach net zero by 2050. In order to contribute to this goal, nearly 8,000 companies around the world have already committed to science-based emissions reductions targets of their own. These include both near-term and net zero targets. Because setting up science-based targets includes a public sharing of targets and goals, it can provide a reputational benefit for businesses. According to SBTi, having science-based targets can increase investor confidence, as well as provide resilience against future regulation. So let's walk through the process for setting a science-based target, or SBT. First, your company commits to a target. This target can either be a near-term, meaning 5 to 10 years, or a net zero emissions reduction target, which must be by 2050. And your company submits a commitment letter to SBTi. Then you have 2 years to develop targets aligned with SBTi's criteria. The next milestone is having those targets validated by SBTi. And as companies progress on the path toward achieving near-term and net zero targets, they publish their progress in annual GHG emission reports. In order to meet SBT validation standards from SBTi, emissions reduction targets must meet specific criteria. For Scope 1 and 2 emissions, targets must cover 95% of the company's Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Near-term targets must be set for 5 to 10 years after the commitment is submitted, and net zero targets must be set for 2050 or sooner. They must also meet a minimum reduction standard of 42% absolute emissions reduction in the near term. This shows a reduction of 42% for near-term target year as compared to a company's base year, and 90% reduction of all Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2050. For Scope 3 emissions, targets must cover 67% of Scope 3 emissions for companies where Scope 3 represents over 40% of their overall emissions. 90% of Scope 3 must be covered in a company's long-term net zero targets. Like Scope 1 and 2 SBTs, Scope 3 near-term targets must be set for 5 to 10 years after the commitment is submitted, and net zero targets must be set for 2050 or sooner. Depending on a company's strategy, Scope 3 near-term emissions reductions can be demonstrated via a few different pathways. It could be absolute reduction, which shows a year-over-year percentage reduction as compared to a company's base year. It could use sector-specific reduction targets. It could be supplier engagement, or a company could use physical or economic intensity. When submitting targets to SBTi, it's important to be accurate, clear, factual, and thorough. The Aptera team has extensive experience working with SBTi and developing science-based targets, and we've included a few of our best practices here. Don't give marketing copy. Do provide clear factual descriptions of the business activities. Don't say that gases you don't actually emit are omitted gases. Do detail any omitted greenhouse gases. Don't label categories as not applicable just because the value of emissions is low. Do fill in the percentage of the category's emissions which are to be included in the target. Don't omit justification of growth projections. Do ensure that growth projections are as accurate as possible. And don't assume a category is irrelevant to your company. Do read the GHG technical guidance for calculating Scope 3 emissions. Thanks for watching.